Good afternoon. Very happy to meet all of you on this very special and important webinar. My name is Geerdam and I'm the immediate past president of the European Psychiatric Association. And on behalf of the other two associations, because this is a joint webinar, I welcome you very much. Joint, and that's important, this collaboration between the European Sleep Research Society, the Federation of European Neuroscience Societies, and the European Psychiatric Association. And the fact that we are collaborating around the topic of sleep indicates the importance of the topic for all the societies. And I think for neurology, neuroscience, psychiatry, sleep is really, really vital. So hence this, I think, very important webinar with excellent speakers. Just to remind, sleep disorders, chronic sleep disorders affect about 20 to 30% of our population in Europe, and the impact is fabulous. Maybe the article I cite now will be also cited by one of the other speakers, but please remind the very just published article estimates in Europe the cost of sleep disorders to about 423 billion in 2019. So this is massive, massive. But without further ado, some practicalities. So we have two excellent speakers. I will shortly hand over to my co-chair, Professor Martin Dressler. The webinar is recorded, so it will be available, and I'm happy to share also that the slides will be made also available thanks to the speakers. So without further ado, Professor Martin Dressler. Martin, I hand over to you to introduce the speakers and guide us through the webinar further.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me briefly... so can you see my screen well? Okay. Yeah, warm welcome also from my side. My name is Martin Dressler. I lead the sleep lab at the Donders Institute here in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And I very briefly wanted to point out why sleep is so important and sleep disorder such a crucial problem. So if you think about it from evolutionary perspective, sleep is a weird behavior in the sense that we spend hours and hours each day in a state that is like highly dangerous in a sense. So during most of our evolutionary history, we didn't sleep in safe bedrooms, but out there in the wilderness. And there are all kinds of predators that are just out there for us waiting to not pay attention. And so far, sleep has to really come with absolutely vital functions to overcompensate for this obvious disadvantage. And over the last couple of years, more and more of these functions have been investigated and elucidated. And like some of them are very basic functions such as energy regulation or biosynthesis, immunological processing. Some of our most important hormones show both the highest and lowest point during sleep. Sleep has been shown to be a state of brain clearance, so all kinds of toxic metabolites that accumulate during the day are being cleared from the brain during sleep in particular. But also higher functions for cognitive functions such as executive function, memory and plasticity, emotion regulation, and even the subjective side of sleep, namely dreaming, has been suggested to serve a biological function in the sense that it might serve as a simulation of reality where we can train all kinds of important behaviors. And you can already see from these functions what goes wrong and can go wrong if we do not sleep properly. But I think the important point here is that sleep does not fulfill a single function, but several functions. So in a sense, you can consider it as sort of the Swiss Army knife of crucial biological functions that is really needed on a daily basis. And today we will highlight in particular how sleep is important for mental health over the entire lifespan. And as Gerd already mentioned, we have two outstanding speakers for this. We have on the one hand Laura Palagini, a psychiatrist and professor of sleep medicine at the University Hospital of Pisa, and her research focuses in particular on sleep, insomnia, and mental health. And then we have Vlad Vyazovsky, professor of sleep physiology at Oxford University and vice president of ESRS, one of the hosting organizations here. And the focus of his research is on sleep, and he focuses primarily on the role of sleep in neurodegenerative disorders, mental health, aging, and metabolism. And without further ado, to leave as much time and space as possible for the speakers and later on also for discussion, we'll move on to the talk of Laura, which will be on sleep, insomnia, and mental health across the lifespan, discussing a position from European Task Force of Experts and revisiting the importance of insomnia and its management in psychopathology. And with that, the stage is yours.
Thank you. It's very long title to say that finally we are really working to try to revitalize the importance of sleep for mental health. I want to thank for the invitation and especially the EPA board really with the effort they are doing to trying to give some importance again for sleep in the process of mental health. Let's say that this international task force started from the Italian Association of Sleep Medicine, from the board, and we are now expanding just to promote the importance of sleep for something that is clearly important for mental health. We are speaking about sleep as a lifestyle behavior, and let's say that sleep is considered one of the major for health behaviors that most directly affect health, but it's just a lifestyle, project, or how does sleep may contribute to maintain and recover mental health? So we are trying to discuss all these points in this time that we have. First of all, let's say that it seems that sleep may play really an important role in mental health, starting from the prenatal life. It seems that maternal health is, and sleep especially, is so important for brain network formation, or during adolescence and neurodevelopment. We know that sleep is so important for the formation of the brain structure related to emotion and cognitions, and especially during adult life. Sleep may play an important role in the regulation of stress and constructing resilience, and also may play a kind of neuroprotective role regulating the immune system. Especially, let's say that it is emerging the role of maternal sleep during the prenatal life. During the last years, we have seen a lot of works on the topic, and it seems that maternal sleep may change, the trajectory of mental health or disorders. And it seems that if the mother has a very good sleep, or quality, duration, timing, organization, this is really important, because maternal melatonin travels from mother via placenta to the brain of the baby, and is going to regulate the stress system throughout the circadian system, maybe playing a kind of neuroprotective role. And we just wanted to test this hypothesis. We conducted a meta-analysis, also looking for the correlation between prenatal sleep of the mother and the eventual problem in social emotional functioning of the baby. And we found that mothers with prenatal insomnia had about 3 times higher odds of having a baby with emotional behavioral problem or bonding problems compared to mother with no problem of insomnia during pregnancy. And it seems that later on, these data have been confirmed in other studies, for example, showing the association between insomnia during prenatal life, the mother, and ADHD problems or problems in the brain neurodevelopment. Let's say that sleep is emerging as a driver of prenatal brain development, but during these years, there are lots of data showing that sleep may play an important role in as a driver in the development of postnatal brain. We know that at the beginning of our life, there is a prevalence of REM sleep. It is believed to be involved especially in the development of the sensomotor areas and involved in process of myelination or neuronal proliferation. During the neurodevelopment, there is then an emergence of non-REM sleep, especially slow wave sleep. And it is believed that, slow wave sleep may play a role in the maturation of the cortical gray matter because, slow wave topography follows the course of cortical gray matter maturation. So is it possible that non-REM sleep may play an important active role in brain development, special cortical, frontal cortical functions? So what's going on when sleep is disturbed during neurodevelopment? There are lots of data and studies about this. Maybe this study is one of the most important. It was published on JAMA Psychiatrist and involved more than 10,000 individuals. And author found that sleep problems were especially related to the increased risk of somatic problems, but also anxiety, depression, and aggressive behavior. That's a very particular relationship. That also, if we look very quickly at neurodevelopmental disorders, we can find that most of the children, around 80% of them, they have sleep problems. They seems not to be just a consequence of, for example, autism spectrum disorder. It seems that there is a kind of bidirectional relationship between sleep problems and the autism disorder core symptomatology. And there are maybe lots of ideas and hypotheses on how they can share a lot of neurobiological mechanisms. It seems that, for example, this regulation of the GABAergic system or orexin and melatonin, they play an important role in this regulating then REM and non-REM sleep, and so the regulation of emotions and cognitions, especially in this kind of people. And it is similar when sleep is disturbed in ADHD patients. We know that 80% of children with ADHD, they have sleep problems. It seems that this is just not a consequence. It's not secondary to ADHD. Sleep problems, they have a kind of bidirectional relationship with ADHD symptoms. And there are lots of hypotheses showing that maybe we have mechanisms that are really shared between ADHD and sleep problems, especially related to the dysfunction in orexin system and regulation of the sleep-wake system that is going to affect in a negative way the communication between the prefrontal cortex and the basal forebrain. It is affected and disconnected in a functional way, probably. This because one of the most important functions of sleep for us is especially during adolescence. We know that prefrontal cortex is under construction, and it seems that sleep really may play such an important role. It seems that regular sleep for an adolescent is important for synaptic pruning, for increasing long-range synchrony, sustaining connectivity of the limbic system, or myelination, or the progression in the development of GABAergic system. On the other side, there are lots of hypotheses showing that maybe when sleep is disturbed during this period of life, these functions of sleep maybe are impaired, and so synaptic plasticity doesn't work on the pruning part very well, or there are maybe alterations in the long range of communication or disruption in connectivity in the limbic system. That's why in this review, we hypothesized that sleep problems during adolescence, especially insomnia, sleep deprivation, circadian sleep dysregulation, they all converge maybe in alterations in the formation of the prefrontal cortex and its connection with the amygdala, and converging in the emotion dysregulation that is the core symptomatology of all the problems during adolescence. There are lots of studies showing that sleep problems are so frequent during this period of life. This one is interesting. It is trying to understand if what is the most important factor that may be related to the risk of mental disorders during this period of life. And so it is emerging that sleep disorder, they really may play such an important role, even being more related to the risk to mental disorder more than, trauma or stressful event. We don't have the time to discuss the important role of sleep in processing trauma or stressful event. Just the time to make a summary of a lot of systematic review of the last few years, all of them saying that sleep problems during adolescence, they are growing. They can be different with short sleep, insomnia, chronic sleep deprivation, or delayed phase. Adolescents, they go to sleep very late in the evening. All of them, they increase the risk of developing major mental disorders, including mood disorders, anxiety disorder, ADHD, but also substance abuse disorder, and especially suicidal ideation and attempts, especially the idea that is, growing during these years is that a brain that is sleep deprived, especially during adolescence, can affect the connection between prefrontal cortex and amygdala, leading to the alterations in the control of emotions and reward system processing. And that's why there are lots of meta-analyses and studies showing that the reduction in the duration of sleep or sleep problems anyway, they may increase of suicidal ideation behaviors and attempts in the period of life, but also they are sleep problems, they are kind of a red flag for the development of substance use disorder during adolescence, and also aggressive behaviors. So let's say that what we are saying also in this paper and in this activity that we want to promote in our country and in Europe is that sleep is very important during neurodevelopment from prenatal life, but everything that we are doing all the night is the same that is going on in an adolescent brain. We are doing a lot of pruning activity during the night to construct our cognitive schemas, and we are doing a lot of work to regulate the amygdala, the control of emotions, every night. So that's important also in adult population, where also sleep has important function in synchronization with the environment, and especially the important function of with the neuroprotective role, regulating the immune system and collaborating to the elimination of the the waste of the brain. So let's say that what we are saying, we want to discuss is that sleep is so important across the lifespan to maintain mental health. On the other side, when there are sleep problems, in our paper, in our work, we are focusing on insomnia because it's the most frequent sleep problem. Insomnia may be a risk factor, we know very well, also in adult population for anxiety, depression, psychotic disorder, or substance use disorder. And let's say that there are a lot of neurobiological, processes that may link insomnia to other mental disorders. It's just not a consequences to have insomnia in mental disorders. So maybe when insomnia is there, or the functions of sleep are affected, and probably, brain plasticity, neuroprotection, regulation of inflammation and stress system, or regulation of neurotransmitters that are involved in mood, or regulation of all the area involved in emotion regulation and reactivity are affected. And that's why maybe there is a strong link with between insomnia and other mental disorders. So let's say that it is emerging during the last years that good sleep is kind of a foundation, an important foundation for mental health. It's just not a good lifestyle. I mean, an important lifestyle to be regular, but it's important just to regulate all the processes related to mental health, brain functions, so neuroplasticity, and regulating immune system, circadian system, emotions across the lifespan. For sure, the fact to have a duration, quality, timing, and regularity of sleep is important, but it is also important to evaluate the presence of sleep problems, sleep disorders, and to treat them according to evidence-based, guideline. And in this way, we can promote mental health throughout sleep. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. We will directly move on to the next talk, but a very brief reminder again, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat. We will collect them there and discuss them jointly afterwards. So, and with that, we'll move on to Vlad and talk on sleep, the brain, and mental health, lessons from basic sleep science.
Great. Thank you very much. It is really a great pleasure to be here and talk about basic sleep research and the role of basic understanding and fundamental understanding of the brain helps us to advance understanding of mental health. Okay, let me... So when we talk about sleep disruption or changes in sleep in relation to mental health, of course, I don't need to explain this to this audience, and we know that there are changes in sleep in relation to mental mood disorders are many and varied, and some of that is fairly well established, and some of that maybe less so, but we know that sleep can be disrupted in various ways, for example, in depression or in psychosis. But when we look at these changes in sleep in terms of sleep oscillation, sleep architecture, so the question naturally arises: where does it come from, and what does it mean? So how can we even approach this question? So a very kind of high-level simplistic view on sleep is that sleep can be of several different kinds. There are several stages of sleep which are distinguished by different types of brain oscillations, such as slow waves or spindles. And sleep has a certain architecture. So it's manifested, for example, in the alternation between non-REM and REM sleep and occurrence of arousals. Now what are the mechanisms which underlie these dynamics? So from a very kind of superficial view, that there is simply like a sleep-wake switch, and there are just a few players within the thalamocortical neurons which determine sleep oscillations and sleep-wake switching. Now we, over the last especially 10 years or so, we have arrived to a very sophisticated picture of many areas of the brain playing a role, making a contribution to sleep-wake states. And on the other hand, we know that sleep and wake are not all or none phenomena. So there is a variety, like a spectrum of states, which can be described with the occurrence of local and global sleep oscillations. Okay. I think I'm okay. And after all, sleep is also only just one state out of many. So I really like to put sleep on a spectrum of different states. Some of them are normal, some are pathological, which are indeed distinguished by the type of brain activity and engagement with the environment. So one type of activity fairly typical to sleep, or mostly typical to sleep, is called slow wave activity, and we now also understand a great deal about the underlying network mechanisms. So we know that slow waves are which you record in the cortex or from the scalp originate from a very peculiar behavior of neurons oscillating between upstate and downstate when neurons are active and silent. And it's really important that slow waves do not simply reflect the state you're in, but slow waves were established as a very strong, useful marker of sleep-wake history. So many of you are maybe familiar with this framework, and according to this idea, sleep-wake architecture characteristics, intensity are determined by the interaction between two processes, process C, which is a circadian process, and process S, which is a homeostatic process which reflects the preceding sleep-wake history. So according to this model, process S increases during waking and dissipates during sleep. At least this is what is supposed to be happening during normal sleep. So as I mentioned, slow activity is a very sensitive marker of sleep-wake history, and this is very nicely illustrated in this experiment in mice, where I plot a time course of slow wave activity during baseline sleep, shown in blue, and after sleep deprivation, slow activity can increase by several fold. So it's a really massive change in brain activity as a function of preceding state. So you can also look at the markers of sleep pressure within waking. So, for example, here you can see a rat that was sleep deprived, and if I compare early sleep deprivation and late sleep deprivation, basically low sleep pressure and high sleep pressure, you can see that individual neurons shown on this, the spike and shows shown on this raster plot, enter states resembling off periods I just described before during sleep. So brain starts falling asleep at a local in a local fashion when sleep deprivation increases. And this may be reflected to this intrusion of slow or slow theta frequencies into wake EEG, shown both in humans and in mice. So what can how we can benefit from understanding the underlying mechanisms determining these dynamics? So one influential theory is that wakefulness and sleep are associated with changes in synaptic plasticity, and I'm referring here to a influential synaptic homeostasis hypothesis, which postulates that in waking is associated with LTP-like processes and sleep is associated with synaptic depotentiation. So there are different ways how you can measure changes in synaptic strengths, and one of them is the expression or phosphorylation of one of the subunits of AMPA receptors. These are glutamate receptors that binds glutamate. It consists of different subunits, and one of them is called GluA1. So these receptors are very important for long-term potentiation, according to the conventional view. And these receptors, these subunits, are upregulated during wakefulness. So what does it mean? So in one of our experiments, we worked with mice together in collaboration with David Bannerman in Oxford, and these animals manifest a very peculiar phenotype. So these animals actually sleep in the first glance totally normally, but they show a deficit in short-term habituation. You can measure this by providing animals, for example, with novel objects or putting them on a maze, and it looks like they don't acquire this sense of familiarity. They treat novel objects with even sometimes increasing attention. This has very interesting and important implication for some mental health conditions such as schizophrenia, and I'm referring here to the well-known aberrant salience hypothesis. So according to this idea, there is an over-attribution of meaning and motivational value to environmental events or maybe states which are irrelevant. And a failure to re-evaluate aberrant thoughts or beliefs may actually contribute to the persistence of delusions. So if you go look at how patients with schizophrenia may reflect on this feeling of constantly dealing with novelty. So I'm quoting here some citations from Kapoor review. Like, I developed a great awareness of, my senses were sharpened, I became fascinated by little insignificant things around me, and so on. My senses seemed alive, things seemed clear-cut, I noticed things I had never noticed before. So what does it mean in biological terms? This means that wake intensity may be to some extent increased. It looks like GluA1 dependent plasticity playing more role into reducing paying attention to insignificant stimuli, possibly even reducing synaptic strengths and allowing to stay awake for longer. So we were looking at mice, at these GluA1 knockout mice, trying to understand what happened during sleep, and then we found something really interesting and unexpected. So when we recorded their non-REM sleep and look at the EEG spectra, we found a very strong deficit in EEG power, including sleep spindles. So sleep spindles are events occurring on the EEG at approximately 10 to 15 Hertz. And you can see on these spectrograms on the right-hand side, the phenotype was really quite striking. So this mice lacking this GluA1 gene encoding for GluA1 receptors basically have very, very weak spindles. Basically, spindles on the EEG are non-existent. So, and this was quantified, and we replicated in two batches of animals. So why is it interesting? Is that because it has been known for, since some time, for example, from work of Fabio Ferrarelli, that schizophrenia is associated with marked suppression of sleep spindles. So here you can see examples when this hotspot of spindles is lacking in patients with schizophrenia, even in unmedicated patients, and this also is very clear on the EEG spectrum shown on the right. So sleep spindles have this very interesting property that they may be playing a role in gating sensory stimuli. Although this is somewhat controversial, not all studies replicate this, but in our work, when we played sounds across sleep in mice, we found that the twitch response was attenuated when the stimulus fell in the middle of a spindle, and this was very clear, clearly present in all animals. So sleep spindles have been linked to sleep fragility or arousability, and you may be familiar with this model proposed by Anita Luty and collaborators. And according to this view, sleep has this very peculiar architecture. In addition to alternation between non-REM and REM stages, within non-REM sleep, there is a fluctuations, which you can measure, for example, by looking at spindle activity, but also the number of these brief arousals. And this correlates also with the activity of the locus ceruleus. So locus ceruleus are neurons in the brain stem which produce noradrenaline or norepinephrine. So this architecture is considered a very normal and very important part of sleep architecture. And there's a lot of interest in research now in understanding how abnormalities, for example, in the activity of the locus ceruleus, can contribute to sleep becoming more superficial, more fragmented. So one idea, and this was promoted by several groups, including Dieter Riemann and by Sommeren, is that hyperarousal, which is closely linked with anxiety, may be a very important factor contributing to insomnia and sleep disruption. And for example, according to this view, disrupted sleep or disrupted REM sleep in this case can result in a lack of dissipation of distress overnight, basically precipitating this vicious circle and leading to even more higher arousal next day, and this can ultimately lead to anxiety disorders. So something very similar we actually find in mice. So if mice are subjected, and this is a work from Iris Havata, if mice are subjected to psychosocial stress, this induces overall brain activity. So this is a chronic paradigm, and it was found that there is an increased markers of brain activity, in this case measured with expression of FOS. This is a transcription factor which indicates how active neurons are. And this may be mediated by overactive locus ceruleus. I would like to cite this early study from Chiara Cirelli, in which they used the technique by ablating locus ceruleus on one side of the brain, and they looked in both hemispheres at the expression of transcription factors, including FOS. So on the left-hand side, you can see comparison of sleep and wake. So FOS is normally expressed more in awake brain, but if you lesion locus ceruleus on one side, then there is a lack of FOS increase on the side which does not receive inputs from the locus ceruleus because that nucleus is ablated. Now let me go back to sleep homeostasis, where I started, and maybe reflect a bit on whether sleep deprivation or wakefulness can be actually useful in some cases. And here I would like to cite this early model proposed by several authors and nicely conceptualized in this work back from 1982 by Alex Borbey and Anna Justice. And according to this idea, depression may be associated with deficit in process S, that homeostatic process that normally increases during waking. And according to this argument, if you elevate process S, for example, by sleep depriving patients, this may lead to an improvement. So this idea has been revived lately and discussed in this term, in terms of a synaptic plasticity model for therapeutic sleep deprivation, which may be useful in some forms of major depression. And these authors propose that by elevating process S, it moves the brain in a window where brain plasticity can be facilitated in some form, and this might contribute to the improvement of depression. So what are these? So going back to neurobiology, so what exactly can be happening during this time when the brain is sleep deprived? And I'd like to briefly talk about our recent study where we looked at the levels of intracellular chloride in mice after waking and sleep. So chloride, as you know, is very important for neuronal excitability because inhibition provided by binding GABA to GABA-A receptors effectively opens chloride channel, and then chloride can move in the cell or outside the cell depending on the concentration, and obviously if it moves inside the cell becomes hyperpolarized, and this is what makes cell inhibited and less likely to fire. So my collaborators here, Colin Ackerman and the group, were quite amazed to discover that GABA can actually be much less hyperpolarizing or even depolarizing if the brain slices were collected during the night when animals are awake, or if the mice were sleep deprived. So if you can just think of the implications that depending on the preceding sleep-wake history, neuronal excitability can be very different, and the response to GABA can be quite different. So some pharmacological approaches can be used here, and if you experimentally manipulate chloride levels, for example, by blocking chloride transporters, and if you experimentally increase the amount of chloride inside the cell, that, as you can see on this EEG spectrum on the right-hand side, you can produce almost like signatures of a sleep-deprived brain. So there is intrusion of slow waves into awake state if intercellular chloride is high, leading to this almost like sleep-deprived dissociated state. But going back to plasticity, it was also found that when the brain is sleep-deprived and more chloride inside the cells, then under certain conditions, LTP may be much easier to induce because inhibition is weaker and there is this residual depolarization that keeps cells closer to the threshold of induction of LTP. And in this case, it is easier to induce LTP, long-term potentiation, to strengthen synapses as compared to when chloride levels are low. So here is at the end. I was thinking how to summarize this talk, and I would like to present this as this diagram. On the right-hand side, you can see some fundamental aspects of sleep and sleep neurobiology that I just discussed, such as sleep homeostasis, plasticity, short-term habituation, local sleep, sleep spindles, sleep continuity, chloride homeostasis, and you can see how they map on the well-familiar notions and characteristics of disrupted sleep in relation to mental health, such as hyperarousal, aberrant salience, state dissociation, deficit of spindles, or process S deficiency. And I hope I convinced you that we can learn a lot about mental health from understanding fundamental biology of sleep. And I'd like to thank my group and our funders and you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Vlad. Thanks again to both speakers. We have now about 15 minutes for some questions and answers. The chat is still open, so still feel free to enter some questions. We received a lot of questions already up front, and I tried to cluster them a bit, indicating maybe sort of most interest for those that were repeatedly asked. And I'll just go through them one by one, but we are still open for new questions. One question that came up repeatedly was about optimization of sleep. So how can sleep be effectively optimized at each stage of life? What is the best way to rest and recharge during the day, maybe power napping or something? And is there any way to get away with less sleep, so increase productivity by sleeping less or being productive despite sleeping less?
It's going to be me or Vlad, I don't know. It's okay.
I can say a couple of remarks. So I mean, of course, this is an important question, but of course, it is framed almost like sleep as an inconvenience, and we want to remove it or do something to sleep because it's on your way of productivity. I think we should be enjoying sleep. It's part of our life. And I think it's really important to not try and eliminate sleep by all means, because it will, I think it will always have some cost for wakefulness. But of course, it can go even deeper. We still do not know what is it about sleep that makes it so vital, so restorative, so important. And I'm strongly convinced that before we have a better understanding, so we are a bit in the darkness in terms of really improving sleep effectively. Probably not everyone would agree with me, but this is my opinion.
Laura, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Vlad. And sleep is such an important, process. You need time, the right time to sleep, not to hurry or power nap. And I think it's really important for us as clinicians to for sure to be sure that our patients they sleep well and don't have sleep disorders, because sometimes we forget to ask about sleep, and we evaluate all the other factors. So it's just important at least to evaluate sleep habits, but daytime, activity of our patients. And if there are some sleep problems, we need to treat them properly.
But I think power naps are great, right?
Yeah, for sure. Great for a lot of people. Yeah.
Maybe another question that also came up repeatedly. However, if sleep goes wrong, what to do? In particular, given the lifespan perspective, advice for teenagers. In many countries, school times are not ideally scheduled, given the chronotype of young people. What to think of that and what to do with it? I think, Laura, maybe would you like to start?
Yeah, I know there are a lot of of studies about that, especially in the US. They actually move, right, in some countries the schedule for school timing is so important. It should be important to evaluate this aspect, biological aspect of adolescence. They are important because they are so delayed, and everything is in contrast with the organization, with the society. So for sure, we should implement the education and information for school, even if we don't move the scheduled time for school. We have to be to implement all the educational processes in the school, also about the importance of sleep and how to improve it, especially in adolescence where they have a lot of late time activity on the screen time and so on. I think we have to improve at a succession, at a level in which we have in the school, especially the knowledge of this important part in adolescence, even if we don't move the scheduled time.
And a related question, what about long-term effects? So if sleep goes wrong or is sort of suppressed in young people due to school timing or so, do we expect on the long term any detrimental effects?
Yeah, I was discussing this point in my presentation before, and especially sleep deprivation, which is a consequence of this mismatch between the biological makeup of the sleep of people with during adolescence and the school time, and so we are going to have consequences. We have seen increase in substance use disorder, suicidal ideation, and risk, and aggressive behaviors, and so on. So that's a kind of an emergency to target sleep problems during this period of our life, in this moment, because sleep problems are really growing in this kind of population.
And any specific recommendations for either youth in general or humans with neurodevelopmental disorders other than just sleep more?
No, there are guidelines for the treatment of sleep problems, of insomnia, especially for people with neurodevelopmental disorders, and also with ADHD and insomnia during adolescence. There are guidelines. What they say is to apply sometimes CBTI, that is typical for this period of life, and also to apply the regulation of the circadian rhythms throughout light, for example, throughout the organization of the life, of the rhythm of the life during the day. So chronotherapeutics and applications of guidelines for insomnia in this period of life are really useful, and they have been developed during these years.
There was one question that maybe goes more in Vlad's direction. So we know that for certain patient groups, like some mechanisms in sleep do not work properly, such as sleep spindles. Can we rescue that? Can we enhance sleep spindles? And if we do so, do symptoms improve?
I know that there were studies trying to improve sleep spindles with benzodiazepine hypnotics. So interestingly, as you know, they decrease slow wave activity, but they increase faster frequencies, including spindles. Frankly, I don't remember if it was replicated, but I believe that there was improvement in cognitive function in patients with schizophrenia. So this is of course very interesting, but we do not really know why spindling is disrupted in patients with schizophrenia. And so once again, we are not necessarily targeting the very mechanism that is disrupted.
Okay, then there were several questions about sort of the older age group, in particular age-related neurodegenerative diseases and recent research on the glymphatic system. On the one hand, can we treat sleep as just a cure already, or a prevention already in earlier age and throughout the lifespan? What are the potential mechanisms influencing or the influences of the glymphatic system on other disorders, on psychiatric disorders? So beyond Alzheimer's disease and neurodegenerative diseases, what are potential connections there?
I'm going, then Vlad, you can obviously, I mean, neuroprogression is, a mechanism that is very important for the chronicity of mental disorders. And so it seems that the role of sleep in regulating inflammation and glymphatic, system is going to be very important also for us as a psychiatrist, not only for neurologists. And there is a very interesting study targeting insomnia with suvorexant, and it is showing that the treatment with suvorexant, I mean, that is a drug for insomnia, is going to reduce the beta amyloid in the brain. So I think it's you can also discuss about that, Vlad. I don't know if you are interested.
About the orexin.
Yes. Antagonism and its effect on the system, beta amyloid elimination. So it seems that if you are going to treat insomnia or other sleep problems, maybe you are going to give a preventive, treatment for mental disorders, because you're going to regulate maybe inflammation, increase in neuroprotection, or regulating emotions. That's what we think now. We have to prove all of them, all this stuff.
Yeah, I think there is still, the discussion is still open if with aging the requirement for sleep is reduced, or if older subjects are unable to obtain sleep that they need, and to what extent there is indeed causality between sleep disruption and neurodegeneration. This is very, of course, active area of research. We are still kind of lacking a theory here, so maybe one idea that I heard recently is that synaptic homeostasis may be disrupted with aging, And this is what something that contributes to neurodegeneration. So this makes kind of targeting sleep mechanisms very, very attractive. But I think we are still lacking the understanding of what the role of sleep is.
One question that also came up repeatedly is the one about inter-individual differences. So people appear to need different amounts of sleep, and that might also differ across the lifespan. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I was discussing this point at the beginning. I mean, there is a trend, a physiological one, and the need of sleep. Maybe Vlad can explain to us what it does mean, the need of sleep, you know. And so, yeah, I mean, we are going to sleep. We have a longer sleep time at the beginning of our life, and then when we are adults, we are going to sleep a shorter time. So we have to consider this part during the period of life, and when you see a patient in a particular age. And also the physiology of sleep is going to change, and to be more, full of awakening during the night, during the elderly period, and more adult life, just because there is a modification in the physiology and the REM, non-REM ratio. So we have to consider all this part in each period of life.
Yeah, exactly. And here, so when we talk about sleep need, we are talking about both sleep duration and also sleep intensity, quality, and architecture, as Laura just mentioned. And they all differ in some way and change dynamically during the lifespan. So my background is in animal sleep research, and I can tell you that there is also a lot of inter-individual variability and even intra-individual variability within animals. Even genetically identical inbred mice, they can sleep in somewhat different ways. So environment also matters. It's not only genetically determined characteristics, but we know that literally from day to day, depending on other conditions from outside, sleep can change, and we should always kind of consider the influence of both your genetic makeup or your physiology, other conditions, age, but also the effects of environment, where, for example, light or stressors would be major factors which will affect sleep, and may perhaps differently depending on age.
Thank you. We are almost out of time, and before I invite Geert for some closing words, one last question that came up repeatedly, and that is, if sleep is so important for public health, for productivity, and so on, how do we best communicate that to the public and convince the public and politicians that sleep is actually important?
Yeah, that's the main point. That's why I want to thanks really EPA for what is doing, the board is doing, starting to promote finally the importance of sleep for the brain in general. And so I think it is a process that it is finally started. And luckily we have to, improve all the educational projects, especially in the school, for example, in the workplaces or in psychiatry. Yeah, it's a work that we want to do with this kind of task force that we created in Italy, but it's very hard.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where our societies can work very effectively together. And I represent European Sleep Research Society, where also there is a number of initiatives, including educational initiatives. And I think this is the power of collaborating between your society and ours and broader FENS, where we can really make a difference in this space.
Ed, would you like to close the session? I already thanked the speakers and everyone for the questions.
Let me continue by thanking you, Martin, for guiding the discussion so brilliantly, because we have been overwhelmed with very, very interesting questions. So I think thank also to the speakers for these brilliant, brilliant talks. And I think they indicate how much there is still to do in research, but strengthen really this idea that sleep is so essential. And Vlad, I follow you completely. I think this joint seminar is just an example of the importance of working together between our associations. And this is the Brain Awareness Week. So I think we really need to put sleep high on the focus and do efforts not only on education, but in joint policy making. And I think this webinar is a very good example for this. So thank you very much. Thank you also for all the people online who were present and bombarded us with so much questions, showing the relevance of the topic. We have to conclude. Very practicalities. This seminar is recorded and you can see it again on the YouTube channel, and it will be subtitled in English, Spanish, French and German, so you can spread the word. And the organizers asked me to beg the participants to fill in the evaluation survey so that we can learn and improve the webinars. So thank you very much, all of you speakers, Martin, all the three associations, all of you, and I wish you specifically a very good night's sleep tonight. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.